In the last video, we discussed at length what was the Boston Tea Party, what were the acts that led to the Boston Tea Party, and what happened after it. But now we have to discuss what happened after the Boston Tea Party. The British government was very shocked after this Boston Tea Party. This infamous incident took place. Do you know why? The British colonial rule never expected this sort of a revolution from the colonists. They believed that the colonists would always be subordinate to them. But in this case, during the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when the masses and the colonists rose in rebellion against the British colonial rule, this caught the British government off guard. Why do you think so? Because they never expected this coming their way. It is at this juncture that they realized that they have to devise some strategy. They have to think of some idea that would curb these revolutions. They have to plan out something so that they can curb all these revolutionary sentiments among the colonists, so that the colonists never rise in rebellion, so that they never protest against the invincible British rule. Following this, in the year 1774, the British government passed a series of acts that were imposed on the colonies. What were these acts? These acts were the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quartering Act, and the Quebec Act. Given the nature of these acts were nicknamed the Intolerable Acts of 1774. But why were these acts called intolerable? What does this word intolerable mean in this regard? These intolerable acts were not enacted by the British government without any reason. But what was the reason behind the imposition of these acts? These acts were a heavy-handed response from the British government against the colonial defiance. The colonial defiance that was expressed through the Boston Tea Party and other revolutionary movements. The British government enacted and imposed these acts on the colonists to show them their subordinate position with regard to British colonial rule. But what were these acts intended to do? These acts were intended to reimpose strict British control over the American colonies. Strict British control in what ways? Firstly, these acts closed off the Boston port indefinitely. Do you know why? The British government closed all trade through the Boston port till the colonists could pay back the immense damages that happened following the Boston Tea Party. This was the reason why the Boston port was closed, and trade through that port was also halted indefinitely. What were the other things that these acts do? These acts, most importantly, increased British military presence on the colonies. The British government realized that they should send huge number of troops on the colonies so that any kind of revolution, any kind of revolutionary sentiment could be nipped in the bud, so that people cannot rise in rebellion against the British government. Huge number of troops were sent to the colonies. These troops also had in them the power to take any building they wanted, and they could operate from those buildings. So in turn, these British colonies in North America were filled with lots and lots of British troops who started behaving like military governors after a point. What else did these intolerable acts do? These intolerable acts removed many colonist officials who were elected by the colonial settlers. These colonist officials were their representatives. That is to say, these officials took care of the needs and grievances of the colonial settlers. So while the British government removed these colonial officials from their elected positions, they sent officials from the British government to fill up those positions. Now, how were these officials? These British officials had no touch with the colonial settlers. They were not their representatives, which is why they were not interested to take care of the demands and the grievances of the colonial settlers. This led to rage and resentment among the colonists. What else did these acts do? In the colony of Massachusetts, where the city of Boston was located, as you can remember, where the Boston Tea Party took place, the British government removed all the elected officials of the colonists. But where was this most strongly enacted? I suppose you remember that in the colony of Massachusetts is located the city Boston, where the Boston Tea Party took place. In this city Boston, all the elected officials of the colonists were removed, and in their place was put a military governor. This military governor started an almost oppressive rule on the colonists. This military governor also banned all sorts of public gatherings. Why were public gatherings banned? Because it is in public gatherings that people unite and organize themselves. They collate their ideas to organize rebellions or protests and demonstrations. It is for this reason that public gatherings were also banned by the British government. Needless to say, the colonists found these impositions very, very oppressive, because a lot of rules were being thrust on them. Along with the revolutionary sentiments that were already brewing up in their minds, these events further added fuel to the fire. What happened after this? As we can already understand that the colonists were seething with anger against the British government. It is for this reason that the colonists, the representatives of these colonists, met for the first time in a congress in the year 1774. But why is the word congress of any relevance here? Congress simply means a meeting of people. But in this case, it did not mean a simple meeting. This meant that representatives from all the colonies had gathered and united to organize their views against one common enemy, that is, the British Army. In fact, the American Parliament, even today, is called the Congress. It is in this Congress of 1774 that the representatives of the colonists realized and discussed that the British impositions were very oppressive. What did they decide to do? They decided to send a petition to the King of England who would redress their grievances, who would repeal the arbitrary taxes and laws imposed on them. But what did the British Parliament do? Let's talk about it. The British Parliament did not treat that petition with any kind of seriousness. In fact, it is said that this petition was treated as another normal notification that was clubbed with lots and lots of paper and stored away somewhere. So, the colonists did not receive any response from the British king. They realized that their petition was left unanswered. The British king had no intention of giving in to their demands and requirements. But before the colonists could think of other ways to appeal to the British Parliament to redress their grievances, formal fighting came their way. In the April of 1775, fighting broke out between the British troops and the colonists. Where did these fightings take place? These battles took place in Lexington and Concordia. As you must remember that the Boston Tea Party sparked the American War of Independence, but it was these battles that officially marked armed conflict between the colonial power and the colonized people. Now I suppose a host of questions are coming to your mind. How did an armed conflict start without anything? How can battles be waged without proper preparation? It wasn't so. Resentment against the colonial rule was already brewing up in the minds of the colonized settlers, which is why they were trying to organize themselves into militias or unofficial armies. But this happened previously, before these wars broke out. What are these unorganized armies? These unorganized armies mostly comprised farmers who had organized themselves into small groups to defend their territories. But after these wars broke out, lots and lots of people joined these militias or unofficial armies. Why were these people joining the militias? Because the colonial settlers wanted independence from British colonial rule. It is for this reason that huge masses were joining these militias. Since these militias had some sort of a formal structure, the wars that began between the British troops and the colonists was not completely unprepared. But you must remember that it was not the colonists who started the war. It were the British troops that finally started waging the wars. What did the British troops think of before waging this war? The British troops thought that they would launch some sort of a surprise attack on the colonists. What would this lead to? This surprise attack would definitely catch the colonists off guard. This way, the British would also be able to siege their lands and resources and all the materials that the colonists had. Or if I say that this was the initial plan that the British troops had when they set out on a chilly night of April from Boston towards the colonies. But would you like to know something? The British troops were being watched at all times, often unknowingly so. But who were watching them? How were their actions being monitored? The colonial governments had set up spies near all British offices to take note of any movement that the British made. This way, they could also prepare themselves for any attack that the British army might launch on them. But who were these spies? These colonist spies were known as the whistling Patriots. These whistling Patriots moved from town to town at night to see what the British troops were doing and to make the colonists alert to any attack that might come their way. Thanks to spies in the likes of Paul Revere and the entire information tally system that helped the colonial settlers prepare for the attack much beforehand. Now, what happened when the war finally broke out between the British troops and the colonial settlers? The colonist revolutionaries were heavily outnumbered by the British troops. Along with that, they were also under-equipped. Why do you think they were under-equipped? Because, as I told you, that the militias were unofficial armies. They were not proper armies or troops like the British counterpart, which is why they were under-equipped. They did not have with them sufficient ammunitions to counter the British attack. But did this deter the spirit of the revolutionaries? Did this finally suppress and kill all the revolutionaries? Most definitely not. The revolutionaries, despite having huge casualties in the war, were being joined by militias from lots and lots of colonies. Militias from all the different parts of the colonies had started coming in to join this one fighting army to fight back the British power. What happened after this? The British power was finally fought back, and unitedly the colonial settlers together with these militias, these unorganized armies as they were, managed to push the British troops back to Boston. This was a huge, a momentous victory to the colonized people because this was unexpected. The British government never thought that they could be countered by these unorganized armies. They never thought that their troops could be fought back by these militias. But this is what had happened, which is why this victory was even larger in magnitude. But what did this victory eventually mean to the colonists? This victory gave a sort of boost of confidence. This victory gave the colonists the belief in them that they can still fight back the British power. Eventually, they organized themselves and did something. Do you know what did they do? They managed to lay a siege on the city of Boston from the April of 1775. How did they manage to do this? We have already discussed that they lost a lot of soldiers to those wars. But along with that, you should remember that many men were constantly joining the colonist militias. And in fact, the colonist militias enlisted any men who was ready to fight for the independence of their colonies. But what happened when the war was being waged between the colonist militia and the British troops? The representatives from all these colonies realized that they should meet together once again. It is in the year 1775 that these representatives met at the Second Continental Congress. But what was the purpose of this Congress? But what was decided at this Congress? It is in this discussion that the representatives decided that they should use the activity of the militias as a reason to send another petition to the King of Britain to prevent any further war and bloodshed on the colonies, and at the same time give independence to these colonies. But what happened after this? Do you think that the British king really listened to what these representatives had to say? To what this petition stated? Let's find out. Earlier on, we saw that when the petition was sent to the king, he simply ignored it as another notification. But this time, this petition further enraged the king. What did the king do? How did the British Parliament respond to this petition? In the August of 1775, the British Parliament declared that these colonies were in a state of rebellion in America, and these colonies were fighting against the British Crown. That is to say, these colonies were in direct conflict with the British sovereign power. What did this imply? By calling this an official rebellion, the British Parliament gave the tag of rebels to the colonists. At the same time, it also declared the Congress as a rebellious and seditious body. This is how the British government had to respond to the petition sent by the American colonists. As we have already discussed, that the British Parliament declared that this was a formal and official rebellion against the British Crown. But what did this imply? This meant that any sort of peaceful discussion or any sort of peaceful agreement between the British power and the colonists could not happen. This officially meant that any sort of a formal and peaceful agreement between the two parties cannot happen, and broke out the American War of Independence at full intensity. This now took the shape of a full-fledged war between the two fighting parties, that is the British power and the colonist militia. In the next video, we will discuss at length what shape the war took, how the war proceeded, and what were the outcomes of this war. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at deltastep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.